This morning, before we get into our lesson, for those of you that are new, I want to go over who you are and what you are, if I will, in the way of a diagram. First of all, we have this diagram here, which shows this is what you are as a spiritual being made in the image and likeness of God. So we are an expression of God. Okay, we are spiritual beings. God is spirit, we are spirit, because God created out of himself, not out of nothing. So we are spiritual beings. The moment we individualized as a spiritual being, we became a soul or took on the covering of a soul. Okay, and beyond that, our soul then formed our physical body while yet in our mother's womb. And so we have spirit, soul, and body, but this is what we are. We are not the body. Now, as we come into the birth of Christ, it's essential that you understand that this is true not only about you, but it was true of Jesus as he came. Okay? We all are spiritual beings. We are housed in a soul, and that soul is housed in a body. The soul of us is in contact directly with the body or the outer affairs and circumstances and events of our life, but it is also in immediate touch with Spirit, with God. Okay, this is the I am of our being. This is the Christ of our being, the God self. Jesus called it the Father within, or it's the perfect self. And remember, Moses, when he had this pure understanding of himself, he said, I am that I am, which means I am that I am within me. He understood then his true nature as a spiritual being. Now we take the same idea and we put it into the mind. See, we all have a mind. But we have three parts of one mind, which is the conscious mind, which is also called the intellect. And we have the subconscious and the superconscious, which is divine mind, perfect mind, God mind. See, that's a part of you too. And all of the knowledge of the universe is in you now. Now, none of us recognize, realize, or understand all of it. And each one of us is here in this life with different talents. See, we don't all have the same talents. We're not all musicians, for example, you see. We're not all mathematicians. You see, we're not all preachers. We're not all teachers. But we all have separate things that we're working on here in this life, and it all comes from divine mind. See, divine mind is constantly flooding us with divine ideas. Remember, this is true of Jesus as well. The only difference is that Jesus could express his God self perfectly. The most perfect expression that we know of today. Okay? And he was consciously aware of his own divinity. And that's what he came to teach us. So, we are flooding our mind, if you will, the workshop of our mind, which I call the subconscious or the soul, and it's being flooded with the divine ideas. It's up to us to reach in there and bring these divine ideas into fruition. But in the conscious part of our mind, the intellect, we are bombarded with all kinds of information from the sense world. And most of the information that you're bringing in from the outer is in direct conflict with the divine ideas of God. For example, the divine idea of God is perfect health, and we see it as disease. See, that's what we see out here. And that's only temporary. It's not eternal. It's not permanent. The divine ideas of God, of peace, love, joy, harmony, order, perfect health, perfect lavish abundance, all of the rest, those are divine ideas. And our job is to express or press out the divine ideas of God at our highest and best at all times. Now, obviously, we're not all there yet, okay? Jesus was able to do that, and he could do it instantly because he knew who he was and what he was. Okay, so we've got conflicting information that we allow in. Once it goes past this point of the intellect, this is where we do all of our judging, okay? Analyzing situations, ideas. We do all that with the conscious mind. Once we allow it past this point, it's all on automatic. It's all on automatic. We are under the thoughts held in mind, produce after their kind, the law of mind action, you see. And God says, it's okay. Whatever you put in there, I still love you. But whatever you put into this part of your mind, into the subconscious, it brings with it a set of consequences, you see. And we have the option, either consciously or unconsciously, of accepting the divine ideas of God or accepting the things out here as the truth, as the source of our good. And so many times we do that. We think of our job, our mate, our bank accounts, our investments as the source of our good. That's our good, we think. But God is our good, because any of these channels can dry up at any time. And if we think that they are the source of our good, then we panic. We get ill. We get scared. And we do all sorts of crazy things trying to run away from it, because we think our source is gone. And the whole idea of the teaching of Jesus Christ, the whole idea of the Bible, is this: put God first, as we will see. Okay, now the metaphysical interpretation of Christmas is going to be in 3 lessons. This is the first one today. And we're going to cover the biblical periods and the unfoldment of man's consciousness up to the birth of Jesus. And when I'm talking about man's consciousness unfolding, I'm talking about yours and mine, because that's what the Bible is. It's a record of man's unfolding consciousness. We're going to take a look at it today. The second lesson, which will be next week, will be the pure metaphysical interpretation of the Christmas story of the birth of Jesus and all of the people and the circumstances surrounding that. And also, it's a story of the birth of your soul. Everything written in the Bible is the story of your soul. And thirdly, the last lesson, which will be 3 weeks from today, will be the ministry and metaphysical teachings of Jesus and how they affect our daily lives. Of course, we won't be able to get all of them, but I want you to see the evolution of man's unfolding consciousness, and then the teachings of this tremendous being that came. Today's lesson will focus on the biblical periods, which are right here. The stories that were written to answer basic questions that we all ask as we want growth and change, and a look at Jesus from a point of view which you have probably never heard before. And that'll be at the end of the lesson. Why did Jesus come? What had happened to man's unfolding consciousness, to man's unfolding spiritual nature that required such a highly evolved being to appear, to come back to us? What was his mission? What was his message? Why at this particular time did he come? We begin by considering the Bible and what it tells us about our own spiritual unfoldment. And the basic idea behind all of the various stories of the Bible can be boiled down to 3 words: put God first. Keep that in mind as we go along. That's the unfolding purpose of your and my soul unfoldment, is to put God first. If you and I had a clear understanding of what it means to put God first, then we would not have a need for anything else. If we truly, purely understood what that means to us. This is the basic message of Moses and all of the Old Testament, because the people never had a clear understanding of it. It was necessary for a highly developed soul as a teacher, for example, as a way-shower, as a savior, to incarnate into this physical world and pick up the theme once again, put God first. Remember, this is a story of your own soul unfoldment, okay, that we're talking about today. The Bible is a record of the unfolding consciousness of man. It's a record of your unfolding consciousness, right up through to the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation was written for the purpose of showing you how to move from mortal mind or sense consciousness to spiritual mind, divine mind, God mind. That's the whole purpose, and it's a beautiful, beautiful book when it's properly understood. The Bible is the record of the unfolding consciousness of man. So in considering Jesus as the Christ, it is important to understand how our souls have evolved and to what state they had grown prior to Jesus' entry into this life, which was about 2,000 years ago. The early stories were written by man to explain why and how certain things happened. Why did certain things come about? For example, the book of Job was written to answer one question: why do good people suffer? Ever had that question? Has that ever gone into your consciousness? Sure has mine. How come? If I'm doing all the good things in life, if I'm following Jesus, if I'm following the Christ, if I'm following God, doing all the things I'm supposed to do, how come good people suffer? It's a good question. It helps us also answer the same question: why do I have to suffer in this life? What's the reason? How come? Well, way back there, as man was growing up, he begins asking some very, very basic, fundamental questions like you and I probably asked as we were growing up in this earth experience. Such questions, basic ones, is where did I come from? Where did I come from? And the answer that probably was given to you, and perhaps you have given to other people, perhaps your own children, is the stork brought you. See, this was an attempt to answer the question from a child's level of consciousness, from a child's level of growth, you see. And in the Bible we find the same thing, as the writer attempts to answer questions at the level of consciousness of the people at that time. In the early part of Genesis, we find the Lord God forming man out of the dust. This was the writer's attempt to answer the basic question, where did I come from? And the basic answer was, the Lord God made you and placed you here. Very simplistic answer, you see. And sometimes that's exactly the way we would answer a child today. The Lord God made you and put you here, you see. Very basic question, isn't it? Another question asked is, if everything in life is supposed to be good, where does all the evil come from? The writer of the 3rd chapter of Genesis says, evil came about because of man's disobedience to God. Isn't that a simplistic answer? He put evil in the form of a serpent. Remember, in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. But there's a very practical aspect of this story right here. And it's this. Whenever you and I do not follow through on the guidance of our own indwelling Lord, doesn't it bring all kinds of trouble? See? We have our own indwelling Lord, which is the spiritual being we are, our God self, our divine mind. And when we don't follow the leading of that, we get into all kinds of trouble. I know I've done a lot of things in life that I knew was wrong, but I said, no, God, just go back where you are, and I went ahead and did it anyway and paid the price. We've all done that, I'm sure, at some time or other. But the basic answer to bring about was put God first. Put God first. These answers usually satisfy for a time, but then as we evolve, or as children begin to grow up, see, as we grow in consciousness, we want more practical answers, so we delve deeper into the stories, and we want deeper meanings for our life. For example, in the creation story in chapter 1, it tells how God created man. Created man, you see. But in the second chapter, it says that God formed man out of the dust of the ground. See? There's two stories of man. The first one is the creation of spiritual man, the spiritual being that you are. The second one is man's emergence into the physical arena of life through a physical body. And that was explained by the writer as God taking something that already existed, such as the dust or dirt of the ground, and forming man. He forms out of what already exists. That's different from creation. Okay? Taking something that already exists. We have lots of examples of that. For example, a carpenter or a cabinet maker, he forms a cabinet or forms a house or forms whatever it is out of something that already exists. Some wood, for example. A seamstress will form a beautiful dress or a suit, you see, out of something that already exists. A builder of bridges, for example, builds a bridge out of material that already is existing. See, that's different than creation. Okay? And God always creates out of himself, not out of nothing. So, everything that we see, taste, feel, touch, smell in this world is God or Spirit appearing as that particular form. All of this illustrates the basic principle, put God first. At this point in man's evolution, man held God as supreme, but with this definite sense of separation between man and God. And God was given human attributes just like man had. See, man began to feel that he was separate and apart from God. God was somewhere else, and man was here, you see. The basic idea of separation. And then, so man began to give God human attributes. And we see it all through the Old Testament, particularly. God is angry, God is wrathful, God destroys, God kills, God punishes, so on and so forth. You see, this was man's concept in his early growth cycle, that God had human attributes, human characteristics. And we get the idea of the man in the long beard sitting in a throne in a white robe and that sort of thing. That evolved out of man's consciousness. So in essence, man also created a God, didn't he? Out of his own mentality. The Cain and Abel story is obviously a continuation of the Adam and Eve story. Another question that was asked by early man is this: if we came from God into a family along with brothers and sisters, why is there dissension in the family? How come? How could this be? We probably ask those same questions. Well, the writers of the Bible answer this question by telling the story of Cain and Abel. Another question that's basic to us all is this: if everything is supposed to be good and wonderful, then how come we have crime in this world? How can that be? How come? Haven't you asked that question before? I've heard it in many counselings that I do. People want to know, how come? Why can this be? So the writer replies, well, let me tell you the story of Cain and Abel. And here's how it all started. It says, see, but don't take any of these stories as final or literal. See? For they are merely basic attempts to answer basic elemental questions that we all have in life. This is unfolding man's consciousness as we're beginning in the primeval area, if you will, and moving out of that. Cain and Abel, of course, were the offspring of Adam and Eve. Cain was a farmer, and Abel was a shepherd. The Hebrew people that the writers were writing to were very familiar with the occupations of farmer and shepherd, and they related to that. They could understand that, and they could identify with the story. So what happens is Cain brings forth the first fruits of his farm to God as an offering. See, this was the consciousness of man. You have to appease God. You have to bring God something so he doesn't get mad at you. Then Abel brought some of his, sheep, lamb, goats, part of the flocks that he was tending over. And the story tells that God accepted Abel's offering, but he rejected Cain's. You'll remember. Cain, of course, gets very upset over this. And later on, he takes his brother Abel out in the field and there kills him because he's jealous. There's envy. This is springing up in the heart of man. This is the story as it's told. Here's where there's a conflict that goes on within all of us, where we let jealousy, resentment, and hate take over our lives, and that is why we have crime and dissension in the family. The very elemental story, very elemental answer for a basic question. This inner conflict is described in the book of Revelation as Armageddon. See, Armageddon is a state of consciousness. It is that battle that goes on within your own consciousness when you're trying to divide the good from the bad, the right from the wrong. In the New Testament, in Revelation, as well as in other parts of the Old Testament, we're showing this double-edged sword. And in fact, John describes Jesus with a double-edged sword. And that means that Christ came to separate the truth from the untruth. Separate the good from the evil, if you will, in our consciousness. Armageddon, again, comes from the Old Testament. It actually shows up in the book of Kings and Judges, and there were 4 great battles that the Hebrew people fought. 2 of them resulted in great victories. 2 of them resulted in great defeats. The pair of opposites. Okay? These were fought on the plains of Megiddo. You can find that in the Bible. And it was a high plain, so in Hebrew it's called Har, meaning high or mountainous. So it's called Har-Megiddo, and over the years the slang word Harmageddon came out. And all of the Jewish people were absolutely familiar with that word. And so we find it in the book of Revelation, which means it's the battle that goes on in your own consciousness as we try to separate the truth from the untruth, from the good from the bad. But here the basic lesson to overcome the human problem is this. Another question that plagues mankind and us today is this question. If God is good, and yet there is all this evil in the world, How come God doesn't do something about it? You heard that one? Okay. So the writer says, hey, let me tell you the story of Noah and the ark and the flood, and give you a basic answer to a very, very basic question. The writer gives the answer, which is this. No, God isn't going to do nothing. God is going to do something about it. And what did God do? He wiped everything clean from the face of the earth, except for just a few people, and God made a fresh start. This is the idea behind that beautiful story. Isn't that a great answer? Simplified indeed, but in our unfolding consciousness, it is an answer we can understand and we can identify with. For us today, it means that we too can have a fresh start from the errors of our way, from missing the mark. The idea is further reflected at a higher consciousness in the book of Revelation again, by the Christ. A high teaching using symbology from the Old Testament, where we see the symbol of the white stone tablet representing our mind, which is wiped clean of all error. As the prophet Isaiah said, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. So what it means is that we can, of all the error thoughts that we put into our mind, you see, we can make a fresh start. We can wipe it clean, so to speak, through the Christ mind. That's the essential teaching. Put God first. In Revelation 1:14, John describes Jesus in his fourth dimensional body and describes his hair as white as snow. Hair represents mental power, while snow represents purity and light. I believe that the story of Noah and the flood has a special meaning for us today. I believe the basic lesson for us today is this. When things are not going well for us in our life, when some kind of evil is running rampant in our life, God is not just standing by and not doing anything. Very much that God did in the story of Noah and the flood. God acts in our lives, and what does he do? He keeps only that which is good, and he wipes everything else clean in our lives, and he makes a fresh start for us. This is the activity of God in us. See, from a human point of view, in our unfolding consciousness, what do we want to do? We want to hang on to guilt, hang on to shame, hang on to fear. Don't want to let it go. All of these bad things are happening. And what God, the Christ mind, wants to do is to let go of that and to begin to wipe it clean, start freshly again. And we can do that in our mind. But this was we had the basic idea, this simple idea, the simple answer to it, but beyond that there's a greater lesson, you see, for us as we dig deeper. The lesson here is under the same general theme. Put God first in your life. Our final basic question that I think is important to us is, why are there so many different languages and races of people on the earth? How come? Isn't that a basic question that kids ask, that we ask? Well, the writer is trying to explain this in a very simple and basic way, and he tells the story of the Tower of Babel. Here we are told man is trying to make himself immortal. This is the idea that of man's unfolding consciousness. Hey, let's make ourselves immortal. Let's make ourselves equal to God. So we decided to build a tower to reach up to God. See, God is separate, somewhere outside, somewhere up in the heavens. So the writer's talking about this story, and he says, well, God looked down, and he saw what man was up to, and then he confused his mind into different languages and scattered them across the earth. That's the simplistic answer, you see, for unfolding consciousness. Remember, man at this state of unfoldment did not have a belief that was established in truth. And so the story had a very acceptable meaning to him at his level of unfoldment. See? Just think of how you answer your children's questions similar to this. You usually don't try to give them a deeper meaning, but you give them a surface meaning that you hope will be satisfied until they can grow up a little more in consciousness and begin to understand the real truth behind it. Same thing with the Bible writers. Answering basic questions with basic ideas. All of these stories, well, earlier I mentioned the book of Job. And the book of Job is a drama, first of all, written for the express purpose of answering the question, why do good people suffer? And the answer to that question is found in the last few chapters of the book. And the answer is simply this: because man is not perfect yet. Isn't that a simple answer? We're not perfect. We're not expressing the pure spirituality that we are. We're not expressing God at our highest and best yet. We haven't moved up that far in consciousness. Very simple answer to a very simple question. Yeah. You got it. That's right. See, all these stories were written about the primeval period of man's existence, and it's so important to trace man's unfoldment through his early years because it lays the groundwork for understanding why a highly evolved soul came to this earth experience. And this soul came in the form of Jesus to help mankind get back on the right track of his unfoldment. As we work through these periods of man's unfoldment, you can see the birth of Jesus, the birth of the Christ, from a very different point of view. Now let's move on to briefly observe the other periods of man's unfoldment as we lead up to that great event of the birth and incarnation of that highly developed soul that we know as Jesus. Next, we have the patriarchal periods, the times of Abraham, who was called the father of the Hebrews. Abraham was originally called Abram until God changed his name to Abraham in the 11th and 12th chapter of Genesis. Abraham's wife, Sarah, was originally known as Sarai until God changed her name to Sarah. All of this is indicating a change to a higher consciousness taking place in the evolvement of man's understanding. We move on even a little farther and we find out where Jacob, remember, got a new name after he wrestled all night with the angel, and he wouldn't let go until he got a blessing, and finally God said, all right, from this point on you will be called Israel. That was Jacob. Still, again, showing an unfoldment in consciousness, moving up to higher planes of understanding. Abraham and Sarah bore Isaac. Isaac bore Jacob and Esau. And we find trickery here where Jacob received Esau's blessing from Isaac. You remember, here Esau represents the natural man, the earthly man, while Jacob represents the mental consciousness within us. And the lesson here is that the natural man is not wise. Esau was a hunter, and he loved sport better than spirit. Remember, he was very hairy all over his body. And that was one way that his father could know that he was talking with him, because his eyesight was failing, and he had to feel, and he felt the arms, and they were hairy. He knew it was Esau. Esau was the firstborn. Esau was not seeking development through soul culture, and in order to carry forward the whole man, it was necessary to supplant and suppress him, the natural man, the intellect, if you will. This is the meaning of the deception by Jacob and his mother Rebekah. She was in the deal with him too. And she says, hey, Esau has the right to get the blessing from the father because he's the firstborn, but she said, I want you to have it. I like you better, you see. And so What it means metaphysically is the mental must gain the supremacy and the physical must lose prominence. This is what Jacob and Rebekah did. They got Isaac, representing the I am, to acknowledge the mind as first in consciousness. Jacob then went to another country which represents apparent separation. We see the same idea brought out in the New Testament where John the Baptist is going around, you see. He is foretelling the coming of Jesus as the Christ. And you remember some of his famous words were, I must decrease, meaning John the Baptist, the intellect, because he represents the intellect. And he said, he must increase, meaning the Christ. And that's the same idea taken from the Old Testament, you see, and appearing again in a different form. This is part of the things that Jesus was doing. He was always going back to the old teachings, you see, and bringing them up with a fresh new approach, a fresh new look at it. Again, we see continued unfoldment of man in consciousness, yet sometimes moving up and other times moving down. Don't we get kind of like that? We get on a roller coaster type thing, and one day we're way up, and the next day we might be way down, you see, in consciousness, in feeling. Next, we have the Egyptian period of our unfoldment, and I want to read you from the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary on Egypt. It says, to the unregenerate soul, it is the land of darkness and mystery. Yet it is essential to the perpetuation of the body. Egypt signifies the darkness of ignorance, obscurity. It has a special significance in the body consciousness, and we often think of it as referring to the subjective or subconscious mind. We also refer to Egypt as the flesh consciousness, sense consciousness, or material consciousness, which would be this part here. This is Egypt. This hidden realm within our organism is in an Egyptian or obscured state to most of us. But we should not forget that it is down in Egypt that we find the grain or substance required to sustain the man. Many workers, in truth, think that it is useless to go into this obscure kingdom within each man. They are not willing that Joseph shall spend a part of his time down in Egypt making ready the storehouses and filling them with the vitality that will be needed when the outer man has exhausted his resources. These will find that they cannot have that joyous reunion of mind and body with all its brothers or faculties as set forth in Genesis 42 through 46. Egypt, we go down into Egypt in consciousness, into the darkness, to bring light. The Christ is the light. Remember Jesus when he came in, he said, I am the light of the world, ye are the light of the world. And we bring this darkness, bring this light into Egypt, into darkness, and begin to evolve out of there. It says the spiritual man, the Christ, the true ego, is the only rightful heir to the divine inheritance, spiritual consciousness. The spiritual man is the only one, the heir to divine ideas, not the body or the physical or the natural man. Isaiah calls it the natural man. He says, cease ye from man whose breath is in his nostrils. That's conscious, our conscious mind, or that is our physical body. Cease ye from man whose breath is in his nostrils, for wherein is he to be accounted for? So what he is saying is, don't worry about the body, the physical man. Put your emphasis on the spiritual man, or put God first. See, that same general idea working. It says, when the spiritual man awakens and finds that he is the possessor of the divine germ or the word of truth, he begins to at once to make use of it. Think of your own self as you awaken to your divinity, to the truth of life, of who and what you are, and begin to put that idea into work in your life. Begin to put the truth concepts to work in your life, to live a better life, you see, a life which is expressing more of the Christ, more of the God self than of the physical self. We need the physical self to work and to do the things in this life. See, we need the physical body. I'm not saying to get rid of it. Don't do that. But you still need it. But we need to begin to look at life more from a perfect consciousness of good, of God. Okay. This, then, is the Egypt that we all go through in consciousness, where the Christ truth is revealed to us and the light of truth leads us out of darkness, and eventually into a full realization of our Christ self as revealed in the book of Revelation. As I said, the book of Revelation moves us from mortal consciousness into Christ consciousness or spiritual consciousness. And it's amazing to get into the book of Revelation, because the number 7, for example, means completion on the physical plane. The number 12 means completion on the spiritual plane. And throughout the book of Revelation, it begins first with all of the numbers 7. You have 7 churches, there's 7 letters, there's 7 parts to each letter, and so on and so forth. And eventually, after you get about halfway through the book, you start getting into the numbers of 12 and their derivatives, such as 144,000. 112 times 12 is 144, and anything with zeros on it means unspecified, unlimited. So we have unspecified, unlimited, unfolding consciousness of spirit within us. And we, when we teach that class, we spend a lot of time with showing how those numbers and what they mean and how they were used in the book of Revelation to show us how to move from mortal consciousness to spiritual consciousness. Under the general theme, put God first. But now let us consider the man who is the central figure of the Old Testament and who appears during the period of darkness, Egypt. And that, of course, is Moses. Now, from the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, it says that Moses means drawing out of or extracting from water. The birth of Moses represents man's development in consciousness of the law of his being, or the negative side. That's it. We're both in polarity, positive and negative. We'll give a class sometimes on showing you why both are necessary in our life. Okay? Just like to make electricity work, you have to have both a positive and negative side. But we know how to control those both. But that's another story. Water represents universal negation. But water also represents the great possibility. Out of seemingly negative conditions comes the new growth. When we are what seems Egyptian darkness and weak as water, we are ripe for the higher understanding. The thoughts that rule in the darkness are bent upon putting out all of the children of light. But if we are of the house of faith, as were Moses' parents, then our desire to bring forth the higher consciousness will find a protector. We must care for the infant thought of truth. Think of that for a moment. We have to care for the infant thought of truth that comes to us all, and surround it with the ark of love and trust, right in the midst of its seeming enemies. See, when truth begins to first dawn in our life, we need to protect it and preserve it and to love it and cherish it and really to surround it with those things that are like its own. Its own will seek its own self. Moses was the lawgiver and represents the intellect becoming spiritually illumined. Moses represents the intellect becoming spiritually illumined. We all go through the Moses state. Definitely, Moses is a central figure of the Old Testament, as Jesus is the central figure in the New Testament. However, in the New Testament, John the Baptist becomes the intellect, not yet or becoming spiritually illumined. You look it up in the Bible dictionary, John the Baptist represents the same things that Moses did. And of course, John the Baptist is out bringing forth the idea of the Christ coming in the form of Jesus. Then we move to the tribal period where you find the rule by the judges. And let me give you just an idea of that period in our unfoldment. It comes out of Old Testament Light by George Lamsa. And says the book of Judges is a chronicle of the days when the Israelites were ruled by judges, whom the people had appointed to lead them during the time of their tribulation. Says the book of Judges must have been written between the years 1400 and 1000 B.C. The book contains some of the most alluring and dramatic episodes of men and women whom God called to lead Israel. The book of Judges gives us the idea of faith, courage, and humility and devotion of these great leaders of Israel who led their people and saved them from their enemies. It's again a period of unfoldment. The greatest thing in the book of Judges is the democratic government and the democratic institutions of the Hebrew people. The period of Judges may be called the first democratic state that the world ever knew. It preceded all other democracies by many centuries, back in the days of the judges. See, and this idea has been nurtured and preserved and grown now throughout until today. The judges were fair to rich and the poor alike, and they were looked upon not as overlords, but as fathers of the tribes. Then we go to the Davidic period, the period of David and others, Saul and Solomon, the period of the kings as rulers of the Hebrew people, in particular Saul, David, and Solomon.